In this video, I want to show a weird data structure I had to deal with at work and how I solved it. This is a sheet where the person has to write whether they were working in the office or at home or they were elsewhere or if they were training or whatever. And if they were physically showing up at the office, they don't have to write anything. It's just assumed that they showed up physically. Each person has one row and each column is one day. But notice how it says column 2 and not the 1st of January. This is a strange setup for this table and why it was a bit of a trouble to solve it. Because I want this 1 and January to be converted into the 1st of January of 2024, and then I want that to be the column header. But that's also not actually what I want. I want to unpivot this table, so I have one column with the person, one column with each day, and then the status for that day. Which means I'll end up with 3 columns, but a lot of rows because each person will have a number of rows equals to the number of days in this sheet. The first thing I want to do is to convert this 1 and January into 1st of January, which I can then convert into the column headers. But that's also not so super simple. What I could do is to add a new row where I need to grab the value in the first row and the second row for each column, but I don't think that's how Power Query works. I wasn't able to figure out how to do that. What I instead need to do is some transposing. So I'll start out by making a new query which references the base. The first thing I need to do is to keep these column headers, which are my original column headers, because notice how the first column is named person and then the second one is called column 2. So normally you need to convert the first row into the column headers, which you can do with this button and then saying use first row as headers. I want the opposite. By going into the transform pane, I have this use first row as headers button, but it's actually a split button, which means I can do the opposite. And I can demode the headers to be my first row. And then I get this change type step, which I need to delete because in the future I should have multiple columns. I've just been lazy and only added 7. This gives me a new set of columns, which I'll need to get rid of, but that's not the priority right now. In normal Excel, I could very easily solve this problem by making a new row and saying that the value should be this value and this month and then 2024. But I can't do that in Power Query. I can't create a calculated row. It might be possible, but it's not something I think makes sense. What I need to do instead is to transpose it because then I can add a column. So very simple. There's a button called transpose and now they've been swapped around. And actually, before I do this, I should do one other thing because I only care about the headers. Because this query's purpose is to create the headers, I actually only need these 2 rows, which means I should select them. Which means before I demote the header, I should select the first 2 rows, which I do under the Home tab, and then keep rows, keep top rows, 2. This leaves me with the day and the month. And then I demote the headers, and then I transpose. Now I simply need to add a new column, which will concatenate my column 2 and column 3 and turn that into a date. And I need to take into account that this first row is going to give me a mistake because this day and month, that does make sense. That's not a date. And I can say that if column 1 is equal to person, then I want to write person because this is what the first column should be called. Meaning for all other rows, I should write first create the date, which is going to be column 1 and a dash and column 3. And then I'm just going to hard code 2024. But I of course don't want this as a literal text. I want it to be a date, the date format, which means I can use the date from function to convert this text into a date. And while it is a date, which I can see by it being cursive and centered on the right, the column type is not a date. And I can't make it a date because person is a text. This is something I'll change later. Now that I have my correct date, I can transpose the table once again by going under transform and then transpose. And now I have my correct column headers in the bottom row, and I need the first row because that has my correct headers, which matches the base query, which means I want to keep the first row and the fourth row. And I can't say keep rows and then range of rows because then it would say maybe I want to keep the third and fourth row. I can't do it like this. What I can instead do is to keep top rows 1, and then because I know I need the last row, I can say keep rows, keep bottom rows, and then I can take this code and copy it, and I want to delete the step because I want this first rows to reference the transpose table, and I want it to be combined with this. Now my first row is the original column headers, and my second row is the new column headers. And I need this original column headers in order to inject this table into the finished query so that I can add these as the correct column headers. Now I want to raise the first row to be the column headers with use first rows as headers. And that was part 1. Now I have the correct columns. Again, it adds a change type step, which I need to delete because in the future I will have multiple columns. Because I haven't actually done any changes in the base query, I can concatenate the two using the append queries. And I want the headers to be my first table because I need to turn the first row into the column headers. So that's fine and dandy. And I made a mistake. I want that to be a new query. I could do this in one query, but for visualization purposes, I want them to be split. And actually that means I need to press this little split button and say append as new. And I don't need to go under there. It was just so that I could choose the order. And I don't need to load these because they're simply helper queries that create this finished table. Because these two queries have the same headers, they will be combined correctly. And that's why I need to do this intermediate step where I keep the original column headers and I have the correct new headers in the first row. Because then I can say first rows as headers and now they've been updated. And again, delete the change type step. I don't need the first 3 rows because the first 2 are used to create the date and the third one is empty, which means I want to remove top rows 3. What I then want to do is to unpivot this table so that, like I mentioned earlier, I have a one column called person, one with dates and one with the status. And notice how it says null here because this is going to be important. I can unpivot by going into the transform pane and selecting unpivot columns, unpivot others, or I can right click the column and then say unpivot other columns. What you'll notice is I only have 12 rows where I actually have 7 columns times 2 people, so I should have 14 rows, but I only have the 7 because whenever I have a null in the column, once I unpivot the table, these null rows get deleted because this means I don't have any data, which is normally how you want things to work, but in my case, I don't want that to happen because, like I said, anytime there's a null, it actually means they physically showed up in the office, which means I can add that as a note. Null rows get deleted, and that's not what I want. The way I can solve this is to create a new step before I unpivot where I convert these nulls into some intermediate value that I know I don't have in any other cell. In my case, because I have text, I can just put in a number. I want to do this replace operation on all columns, which there's a bit of a trick to. To begin with, I'll just reference the step I want to change, which is remove top rows. And upon this table, let's just select all the columns and then say replace values null with 9. And the way the function works is you provide a list, the curly brackets, of all the columns you want to change. But these are hard-coded, and I want this to work in the future when I have multiple columns. I can use the table column names function to grab a list, which is the format I need in my function. This is a list of all of my column headers, and this does mean I replace nulls in the person column, but that shouldn't be a problem. I can copy this because the output is a list. Then in the replace value function, I can replace this list with my function which provides a list. And of course it can't reference replace value because that's the step itself. I need to say that should be unpivoted. No, that should be custom 1. Custom 1. And now it does what I want it to do. And when I then unpivot, it will not delete the rows that are null. And actually I should not do 999 because I do want it to say office. So this is actually fine. I would have to do this step anyway. But I don't want this custom 1 step because it's a pointless step. It simply references a previous step, which means I can remove this step. But I don't want this to reference the unpivoted other columns because that's a mistake actually. I'm choosing to keep it in here for illustration purposes so that I can compare the 2 steps. Now I can unpivot it. Now I have my 14 rows instead of the previous 7, which was wrong. And that means the only thing I have left to do is I don't want this column to be called attribute because it's a date, and I don't want the value column to be called that. I want it to be called status, which I can change up in the code. And then the only thing left to do is to change the types because this should be a date, but it's not a date type. And these two should be type text. And that's everything. That's the done table. And of course you would have many more rows, 1 row for each day with data for each person. So yep,